Who am I? You sure you want to know? The story of my life is not for the faint of heart. If someone said it was a happy little tale...
Satsu?
Yeah?
What are you doing?
Nothing.
Anyway, welcome to Spider-Man Month.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Spider-Man Month. My name's Satsunami, and swinging in once again is none other than the one and only amazing Andrew. Andrew, welcome back.
Hi everyone, glad to be back, and looking forward to talking about another episode in our Spider-Man Month.
I was indeed going to invite Adam or Craigie C, but I have been told by the Red Panda lawyer that they are contractually obligated to film their spin-off podcast. So, unfortunately, it's just going to be you and I tonight, Andrew.
Oh, no Sinister Six then?
No, it's more like Troublesome Twos, I think. Devious doubles, if you will. But yeah, how are you doing tonight?
I'm good, yeah. Christmas and New Year have come and gone here. A happy New Year to all our listeners. It'll be New Year from the previous episode, but not when we recorded it. But yeah, it's been lovely here. Great to be back in the Satsunami Towers, the recording studio, to speak again on another podcast episode for the year.
I know. Honest to goodness, I feel as if 2022 has just gone by in a flash. Christmas came and went, New Year's came and gone, and now we're on our second episode of 2023, so absolutely crazy the speed that this podcast is going at. As we kind of alluded to, we of course are going to be talking about Spider-Man, but we are indeed going to be focusing on, quite frankly, one of the more infamous periods of Spider-Man. And of course, I'm not talking about the 2007 Spider-Man 3. I'm talking about the 2012 and 2014's Amazing Spider-Man series. Contrary to popular belief, it might not be as amazing as some people make it out to be, especially that Mark Webb, if he tries to tell you. All joking aside, Andrew, do you want to paint like a picture of this time period in Spider-Man history?
Around this time, we have had sort of a renaissance of superhero movies. The MCU is in full swing. We have the Dark Knight trilogy is coming to its conclusion. We have the Avengers movie coming out the same year as the first Amazing Spider-Man movie. We've had the first Iron Man movie, the first Thor movie, the first Captain America movie. Superhero films are in a very different place than they were at the time of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man series. So we're in a very different place culturally in terms of superhero films, and so it provides a certain context to the films you are watching that you have much more to compare it to than you did during the Sam Raimi run.
Because, I mean, as we said last week, we were indeed talking about how when the Sam Raimi films came out, the genre, I suppose, as a whole for superhero films were very lackluster, I suppose is the right term. They weren't really revered as being these epic blockbusters. They were seen as being quite silly, quite juvenile. There was only a handful that really broke through the mould. But as you said, as soon as the MCU came into full swing, which we're going to probably talk about it later, but I would say the MCU probably had positives and maybe negative effects on this run as a whole and how the studios handled said films. But it is weird to think that it only took about 5 years from Spider-Man 3 to The Amazing Spider-Man for superhero films to change so drastically.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It was a huge jump from Spider-Man 3 to where we are in the year 2012 with The Amazing Spider-Man, with so many incredible superhero films coming out around that time. I think the most notable would be the first Iron Man movie, which really kind of kicked off the modern era of superhero movies. Also honorable mention to Batman Begins, the first Christopher Nolan Dark Knight Batman movie, which both of those movies I think were the benchmarks of what superhero movies were and could be, and started this new wave of more high profile superhero films.
Don't get me wrong, all the actors who were in those MCU films, they were like relatively established, but I feel as if it just put them all into the spotlight. You know, you had Chris Evans, Robert Downey Jr., and as we've established, superhero films at the time were completely in a different place. They were in such like a high standing with the public, but at the same time, and you'll of course know the reason behind this, but there was a particular reason why they decided to reboot the Spider-Man franchise, because it was about 5 years in between Spider-Man 3 and The Amazing Spider-Man. So the Sam Raimi trilogy was relatively fresh in people's minds. But do you remember the reason why they decided to reboot it so fast?
Yeah, so because of the Sony Marvel deal, where Marvel had sold off its rights to Spider-Man to Sony, Sony had an obligation, as well as Fox with their respective Marvel properties, they had an obligation to make a movie I think it was every 5 years, or it might have been every like 6 years, within a 6-year time period, or else the rights would return back to Marvel, who at that point were owned by Disney. So Disney would then own the rights to Spider-Man. So Sony, to protect their ownership of what is their most valuable IP, they produced a brand new Spider-Man movie. And rather than returning to a now aged and not particularly favorable Tobey Maguire Spider-Man after Spider-Man 3, they decided to take a fresh new perspective on it and go a different direction. So they approached Mark Webb to direct this new movie rather than Sam Raimi, and cast Andrew Garfield in the titular role of Peter Parker and Spider-Man.
It does seem weird to think, though, that they did have the relatively bare building blocks for a Spider-Man 4. You know, they had, like, the Vulture costume prototype, they had the... Like, I don't know how far, if they had, like, the full script or kind of the basic outline for the film, but they definitely had something to go forward with, but obviously because of disputes and everything, that completely fell through. We had a myriad of YouTube videos, which, as I said last week, that were all, oh, look, it's Carnage, or oh, look, it's Shocker that's going to be in the next film. And of course, that never materialised until they actually announced that, as you said, Andrew Garfield was going to be taking on the mask and the web shooters. Well, technically, Tobey Maguire didn't have web shooters, but that's beside the point. I know, I call myself a Spider-Man fan, Andrew. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, it was quite a strange time because obviously, as you said, Sony had to make this film to keep it, but nobody was really, and this isn't like a slight against anyone who worked on the film, not the actors, not the director, nobody, but nobody was really asking for this film, were they?
No, I think we were already pretty satisfied with the superhero films that had come out. We were happy with the Spider-Man films that we had, so there wasn't a great clamoring for a new Spider-Man film unless it was a Spider-Man film that was part of the Marvel universe, because that was one of the great criticisms with Spider-Man at the time, that he could not be a part of the rest of these Marvel characters like he is in the comic books because of the ownership of the fact that Sony owned Spider-Man, and so Marvel couldn't play with one of its most favorite toys when it came to making the Disney Marvel movies, which is of course why, when we'll get to it next week, but it was such a big deal when during the Tom Holland run we were able to branch them together and make a cohesive Spider-Man within the MCU.
Because it's quite weird if you look at external Spider-Man media, like for example the comics, the TV shows, you'll see a lot of crossovers. You'll see Spider-Man fighting with the X-Men, you'll be fighting with the Avengers, you'll be fighting with this whole colourful cast of characters, but obviously due to ownership rights and everything, the same can be applied to the films. And it does seem like that definitely limited it, because at the time the MCU was a relatively new concept. Like, don't get me wrong, crossover films were a thing.
Freddy meets Jason.
Yeah, Freddy meets Jason, King Kong versus Godzilla, you know, those kind
Alien
of films.
versus Predator.
Alien versus Predator, that was the next one. But that's exactly the case. It's like, it's not a new idea to say, oh, we're going to cross these characters over. But at the same time, when it came to Spider-Man, it was like, well, where is the X-Men? Where's the Avengers? Where's all these different superheroes that they could feasibly use? And obviously, because of, as we said, the rights to these characters, they couldn't use them. So there was definitely a kind of appetite for an expanded universe, much like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but we will indeed get into why that really failed here. But see, without any further ado, will we just... I don't even have a funny segue. I don't know. Does this deserve a funny segue, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, maybe you're more critical of these films than I am. I don't think these films deserve as much ire as they get, but we'll get into that soon after the ad break.
But do you believe that if you could do a good segue for the podcast, you indeed have a moral obligation to do those kind of things? That is indeed what is at stake here, which is a very long-winded way to say we will be right back after these messages.
With great ads come great podcasting.
That was actually a good segue. Welcome to Satsunami, a variety podcast that discusses topics from gaming and films to anime and general interests.
Previously on Satsunami, we've analysed what makes a good horror game, conducted a retrospective on Pierce Brosnan's run as James Bond, and listened to us take deep dives into both the Sonic and Halo franchises.
Also, if you're an anime fan, then don't forget to check us out on our sub-series, Satsunani, where we dive into the world of anime. So far, we've reviewed things like Death Note, Princess Mononoke, and the hit Beyblade series.
If that sounds like your cup of tea, then you can check us out on Spotify, iTunes, and all good podcast apps.
As always, stay safe,
Stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
Movies and feelings. Pop, pop. Bring Your Own Popcorn is a podcast that dives into people and the movies who love them. Let us preach to your choir or stoke your ire as we spiral down memory lane with cult classics, Jurassics, and other genres that rhyme with traffic. What we lack in education, we make up for with comedy, compassion, and camaraderie. I'm your host, Mixtape Majesty, inviting you to join me and an assortment of wonderful guests on fine podcast apps everywhere. Bring your own popcorn.
This episode is sponsored by Zencastr. If you're a podcaster that records remotely like me, then you'll know how challenging it can be to create the podcast you've always wanted. That's where Zencastr comes in. Before I met Zencastr, I was but a naive podcaster, recording on low quality, one-track audio waves. But with Zencastr, you can kiss those fears goodbye as they provide crystal clear audio and HD video. Plus, with our all-in-one podcasting suite, recording with guests is extremely simple. From local recordings to post-production, Zencastr has it all. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code CHATSUNAMI. You'll get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. I want you to have the same easy experience I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. So the way we're going to structure this episode is very similar to the way we constructed the last episode. We're just going to be talking casually about The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and indeed 2. I feel as if we kind of did a disservice to Raimi's films by leaving Spider-Man to the last time, because we felt as if, although, he was obviously entertaining, he did a serviceable job, Spider-Man, ironically himself, wasn't probably the strongest part of that trilogy, except for maybe 2, but, we have a whole episode on that. But will we talk about our main lead, Andrew Garfield?
Yeah, for sure. My thoughts on Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man and as Peter Parker is that I've warmed to his Spider-Man since I watched his 2 films last year and again within this last week for the recording of this episode. I do think that he is better than I remembered him being, and I particularly think that he is one of, if not the strongest Spider-Men. As the character, when he puts on the mask, when he acts as Spider-Man with his quips, I think his quips are very well written, very, very well delivered. I think he works very well as Spider-Man. I think he fills that role as the comics would have him filled. I think he does the best job. As Peter Parker, he is less believable. And it isn't like my initial kind of interpretation of it was, oh, he's this handsome skater boy. Like, that's not the Peter Parker that I see. I see Peter Parker as an awkward teen who gets bullied and maybe looks kind of like a bit more handsome, a bit more built out once he's had the spider bite. But from the outset, he's already a handsome Andrew Garfield. However, Andrew Garfield chooses to counter this by acting very awkwardly and like hunching over and like having very strange mannerisms and this put on New Yorker accent because the actor himself is British. I don't enjoy his Peter Parker very much. I don't think it's interesting to watch. I find him a bit irritating, but that's just me. What are your thoughts on his portrayal of Peter Parker?
I would agree with that. I think that definitely as Spider-Man, I remember rewatching these films, and I remember when I watched them at the time, I thought, oh, I hate this, because I was still enamored with the Raimi trilogy, because it was really just a bias that I had, because it was like, I grew up with these films, I love them, I love the campiness and everything. So when The Amazing Spider-Man came out, it almost, actually, this is going to sound like a very weird comparison, but it kind of reminds me of the shift between, for example, in James Bond, Pierce Brosnan's run as James Bond versus Daniel Craig's. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because, for any Bond fans, you'll know what I'm talking about here, but Pierce Brosnan, when he played James Bond, he was very kind of goofy, campy, over the top, and there was always kind of a relatively satisfying conclusion to his stories, whereas when it got to Daniel Craig, it was a lot more brooding, serious, and that's kind of what I think happened with these films, and I feel as if that kind of ties into Andrew Garfield as a whole, because first of all, rewatching these films, I think out the three of them, completely agree, he is by far the best actor. He is such a talented actor. As Spider-Man, he's very quippy, he's very, oh look, I'm your friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man. I love the fact, and this is something I have to admit that the MCU expanded on, that they got him to do things for the community. Like there's a scene in, I think, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 where he actually helps out a child getting bullied and things like that, and you know, he walks him home and everything. I love small scenes like that where he's like helping the community. In the first film where he saves the wee boy and he puts the mask on him to, you know, be brave and everything, I love the way they characterise Spider-Man in that. But when you get to Peter Parker, it feels as if the whole tone of the film doesn't fit the kind of cheery optimism of Spider-Man, if that makes sense. On the one hand, you've got like this very colourful character who's like, oh, look at me, with great power comes great responsibility. Well, actually, they don't say that, but we'll get onto that later. You know, you've got the colourful Spider-Man, and then in the background, you've got corporate espionage, you've got spies, you've got, of course, the spin-offs that they were planning in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So it feels as if they all kind of conflict with the fact that you're watching a film about a colourful character called Spider-Man. I have to say, Spider-Man's a bit of a dick. Like in the first film, you know, see the scene where he's hunting down his uncle's killer, which, by the way, does he ever find his uncle's killer?
I don't think he does.
This is something that another reviewer brought up, and I was like, holy shit, they're right. Where he goes to hunt for his uncle's killer, doesn't find him, and then one of the thugs is like, oh, we're going to find you and your family, we're going to kill you. And only then is that the moment where he looks up at like this poster and he's like, to get away with my crimes, I should wear a mask. And it's like, Jesus Christ, Peter, that is just brutal. He might as well have just worn a balaclava and been called Spider Thug at that point, because it is, he's like, he webs up a guy, nearly chokes him, and then he does threaten him. He pulls down his sleeve and he sees he's not got the, you know, the tattoo of the guy who murdered his uncle, who, again, not important at all, because after that scene, he kind of just gives up.
An argument against that could be that he kind of has that realization that that's not what Uncle Ben would want, or rather not, he personally doesn't have that realization, but he kind of speaks to Aunt May and kind of has the chat with her and comes to the conclusion that he shouldn't be doing what he's doing. Yeah, and so I think that is the point where he has a resolution to use his powers for good and to hide his identity, because he's told that, as you say, that showing his face will just lead to people figuring out who he is.
I do love the scene where practically see that transition where he saves the wee boy on the bridge from, you know, the fallen car and everything. And it's like a really sweet moment, because it's not just, oh look, Spider-Man swooping in like in the Raimi films. It's like he actually has to talk to the child, coax him out, be like, you know, don't be afraid, I'm a Spider-Man, which, again, if I was a child, I would be terrified regardless. And then he takes off the mask and it's like, oh my god, it's Andrew Garfield, I'm a huge fan.
I particularly like the montage we see of him creating the suit and creating the web slingers, and follows those two like nerds around who are like talking about the best pendulum swing action that Spider-Man could use, and he's like making notes behind. Like, that's all very fun. I made a note that he's like this top level scientist and also a fantastic seamstress, and like just what a dangerous combo that is.
Because, I mean, in the Raimi film, he really just draws it, doesn't he? And then in the next scene, it's like, oh yeah, I've got it. You know, I've got this really well-made, tailored suit.
Yeah, that's like insane that Peter in that universe just does that.
What I will say is I do think that the Raimi suit, out of the 3 film series that we're going to talk about, I think the Raimi suit still is probably the best looking, but in terms of an in-universe explanation for how he made it, it's probably the most BS. At least it made sense when, as you said, he's trying to think of like, oh, it has to be a spandex suit because it's least wind resistant. He has to have like the goggles as well with the spider eyes, but he has to have them because obviously he doesn't want wind in his eyes. So that is cool. Here's a question for you though, like going back to his characterization, do you think he can be quite horrible in some scenes that kind of offsets his goodwill, or rather the goodwill that he's set up in previous scenes in the films?
I can't think of any necessary examples of him being particularly horrible. There's points where he becomes quite like moody, and I think there's usually justification. Not that anyone should be justified in treating someone poorly, but you can understand where he's coming from in certain situations and why he's in the dark place that he's at. But there is one scene actually I noted in the second one where he crosses the road to go meet with Gwen Stacy and just causes a car accident.
Oh, yeah.
Just he's like, oh, Gwen, hi, Gwen, and just walks across the street. He like stops a car initially, like, okay, that was a bit rude. And then he crosses another one and like a car just crashes into another car because he like avoid hitting him. And then he just like continues about his day. You would need to hang around and file a police report. You've just caused this accident.
There's a lot of really weird, inconsistent moments in Amazing Spider-Man 2, and there's 2 particular scenes I want to draw attention to. First of all, the one you were referring to there where he walks across the street. There's like an even worse one where he's riffing with, is it Paul Giamatti?
Paul Giamatti, yeah. Oh, absolutely wasted role for him.
Absolutely. He's so like hammy and over the top. That's what I love about him, because out of all the villains, he does stand out. But the issue is, yeah, as you said, he's very underutilized.
I don't know how familiar you are with Rhino in the comics. Rhino is a big dumb idiot.
Yeah.
And so the kind of clumsy quips that Paul Giamatti's Rhino has in this fits that. But Paul Giamatti is such a good actor that I'm like, oh, why couldn't you have picked someone else for this role and use Paul Giamatti for something else? Like, I really hope that Paul Giamatti gets used in like the MCU or something else, because he is so fun to watch. He's such a fun actor.
No, he absolutely was, like, no pun intended, but he was criminally underutilized in this film. But the amount of people that Peter could have saved, see in the very beginning where Paul Giamatti's driving down the street and he's crashing into all these cars and all these vehicles are flying in the air, and Spider-Man's just like riffing on them. He's like, hello, I'm your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. See, if it was a one-on-one, fight and there was no civilians around, you think, okay, that's pretty funny. But you're looking around and you're like, Jesus, Spider-Man, I'm pretty sure someone's mum just got crushed under that van that got thrown in the air. What are you doing? We'll talk about that later probably, but like the whole tone of that film's all over the place. But another scene, and again, there is a semi-justification for this. It's what I like to refer to as the Green Goblin Make-A-Wish Foundation scene, where Peter goes to visit Harry, and without any kind of reason, he says that he won't give him his blood because his friend Harry's dying, who, of course, he becomes the Green Goblin later on. And for some weird reason, he thinks that Spider-Man's blood will heal him, even though later on he gets a suit that heals him, which I kind of think, well, that was a waste of time, but he doesn't give him the blood, and I kind of get why he's saying...
I thought he used the spider venom.
He does later, but it's like the spider venom in the basement. It's not his blood itself.
Yeah, I know, but it wasn't the suit that healed him.
No, but there's like a kind of weird cutaway where he uses the spider venom and, he does that like very overdramatic, oh, I'm dying, and he's tearing his shirt for some reason. But then he climbs into the suit and you see like a status screen or something that says body damaged, activating healing protocol or something. And I was like, why didn't you just start off with that and see how you got on? And I know why, because obviously they wanted the Green Goblin to come into effect and everything, but in universe-wise, you're like, they probably could have started with that, then went to the Spider Venom, but, obviously that's a hindsight thing. But I'm quite curious, what did you think about that scene? The scene where he begs his friend to give him his blood, and he's like, yeah, no, I don't think so.
I can understand it, because, he understands that his blood might not be effective and might end up killing his friend, and so doesn't want to give him something that might make the situation worse when they're still trying to figure out alternatives. And I guess also he's concerned about his identity being figured out by using his blood, maybe. So I could understand. I don't think, and this is kind of always the case with these kind of movies, that it was conveyed between characters very well. Like the conversation should have been more clear as to why. And instead of him just being like, oh, I can't tell more, and just jumps out the window. At which point Harry yells, "You're a fraud, Spider-Man."
Yeah, that was hilarious. Where he's just like, you're a fraud, and he's smashing everything. And he's just outside his window. It's like, Jesus, go away. You've already done enough damage. It's like, can you save my life? No, but look at this sick trick I can do. What I will say, to kind of summarise my thoughts here, I do think that Andrew Garfield probably was overhated at the time, but I can kind of understand why. Obviously, again, it's not justifiable to throw hatred and vitriol at an actor just because you don't like the portrayal, but at the same time, the reason for that was probably because it was so early from the Sam Raimi films, and I don't think people were quite ready to let go of that. And then, as we said, there was so many MCU films and DC films that were coming out. They were doing such a better job of conveying those storylines compared to what the Amazing Spider-Man films necessarily did. But kind of moving on from that, will we talk about because we mentioned Harry there, will we talk about Peter's inner circle? Because we did, surprisingly enough, we did talk a lot about his aunt and uncle in the past film. Would you say they're as prolific in this film?
I like Martin Sheen as an actor, and I think he does the role of Uncle Ben well, but I do not think he's as good as Cliff Robertson, and that might just be nostalgia glasses for what was my Uncle Ben. My Uncle Ben being the Sam Raimi's Uncle Ben, played by Cliff Robertson. I don't buy Martin Sheen's portrayal as well. I don't find him as homely.
Yeah. He seems very aggressive, doesn't he? Throughout the entire film. And this is something I kind of joked about before we went on the ad break there, but in the Sam Raimi films, we talked about how Uncle Ben was very welcoming and he tried to be the best kind of fatherly figure to Peter and everything. And this is just quite shouty. And don't get me wrong, I get why, because there's really bad things that Peter does, forgets to pick up his aunt and things, and he's just quite angry. But then we get to one particular scene where he does the whole great power comes great responsibility speech, and I absolutely loathe this scene for a number of reasons, but I'll just read it out quickly. Instead of saying, with great power comes great responsibility, he talks about how his father is like Peter, hashtag you got your mother's eyes, all that. And then he says, he believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. No choice. Responsibility. Here's the question. Would you buy a t-shirt or a backpack or a sticker of that phrase?
No, I can't say I would. It's so ingrained in me, the with great power comes great responsibility phrase. Was that unique to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man film, or was that something from the comics or the cartoon or anything like that? Has that always been something with Spider-Man, or was that from those movies?
Yep, very first comic, would you believe? Introduced by Stan Lee, it originally appeared as the closing narration in the 1962 Amazing Fantasy 15. It was later attributed to Uncle Ben as advice to the young Peter Parker. It's always been a staple of the Spider-Man franchise. It's not like you could say, oh, with great power comes great responsibility as a Sam Raimi thing. So why they cut that out, I have no idea. Maybe they thought it was too close to the bone, but I mean, the guy shoots webs, for God's sake. It's the same with the Sam Raimi trilogy, so why they took that out, I've got no idea. But funny enough, you mentioned that Paul Giamatti is criminally underused in these films, because I feel as if Sally Fields is also underutilised. Would you agree with that?
I don't know. I don't think Aunt May necessarily needs a lot there, but I think that she does the role very well, and I think she is better than Rosemary Harris and is also much more believable as an aunt instead of like a grandma.
I have to admit, it's not something you really thought of when you were watching the films, but the more you grow up and look back at it, you're like, yeah, why is she a grandmother rather than an aunt? It just makes no sense, but sorry, go on.
Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris actors are like 20 to 30 years older than what they should have been from what logically makes sense as an aunt and uncle. Like if they were like a great aunt and uncle, it makes more sense, but no, it doesn't really make sense for their age ranges. But yeah, no, Sally Fields, I think, does very well in the role. I think she's very believable. She has such an impressive acting range and emotional range that she's able to portray. I think she does play the role of what is essentially just like a concerned aunt at all times, because as you say, there's not too much that they do with her Aunt May character other than her just being concerned about Peter coming back with like a black eye and coming back super late at night and having a very creepy wall covered in thread and pictures and stuff, trying to solve what happened to his father and mother. There's always so much concern over the father and never the mother. The mother is like never brought up. It's always about Richard Parker.
It's actually so true. Oh my god.
I don't even know what the mother's name was.
Definitely not looking up Spider-Man's mum. Spider-Man's ma. Right, okay. Mary Parker, I was right. But how would you know that off? It's not like Martha Wayne or something like that. How do you know that name?
Just the reason I remember Richard Parker is because they cast the same guy from Life of Pi to be that scientist CEO guy who is also in Life of Pi, and the tiger in Life of Pi is called Richard Parker.
So he is, yeah.
And so every time I just go, Richard Parker.
That is so true. You're completely right, though, because there's even a scene where Aunt May just breaks down. It's just like, why are you so concerned about your father? And he's like, oh, I gotta find my father. It's like, but why? This deadbeat, like, just ran away. You know, well, obviously he's not a deadbeat, but...
The father's plan, the parents' plan, was they didn't want Peter to always be looking over his shoulder, growing up always looking over his shoulder, and that they're in danger. If that was so much a concern, why didn't Richard just leave and Mary stay with Peter? Why did they both need to go? If the concern is, oh, well, Mary would be in danger if she stayed, then why wouldn't Peter be in danger?
I'm going to be honest, I don't think they wanted their child. They just got an out and they were like, bye, enjoy your time with your aunt and uncle. That's the way it kind of feels, isn't it?
I will give them credit for the fact that we actually address the parents in this one, and we get a little bit of backstory, which we do not get in any other live action movie. We don't get any semblance of a backstory to Peter's parents in any of the others. And like both the first Amazing Spider-Man and the second Amazing Spider-Man start with clips showing a little bit more of the backstory. In the second one, we have them fleeing on a plane and then fighting this like agent, and he's like trying to like upload some files at the same time, like while he's fighting. I love so much that in what is so the film takes place in like 2014. We'll say 2014 it takes place in, because that's when the film came out. They leave Peter Parker when he is, let's say, 6. So about 10 years prior. So we're looking at probably about 2004 when this event takes place. What airplane has an Ethernet connection to begin with that he can plug into that is so good that even when the plane is plummeting following a exploded engine, that he is able to upload these files this quickly? You couldn't download a picture within like 10 minutes in 2004 from your home. The internet in this 2004 airplane that's crashing has better Ethernet connection than most houses in Scotland do now.
You know, I don't even think I got my own, well, not my own, but like the family computer until like 2005.
I didn't get my own private jet internet until last year.
Do you know, that was like a very missed opportunity for one of these internet companies to be like, you know, those files Richard Parker uploaded before he died? That was our internet connection. Like Sky Broadband coming in and being like, oh yeah, that was our...
AT&T or
Verizon coming in.
Our internet works even when crashing a plane.
Your plane might crash, but your internet won't. Just a tagline. Do you want to know a fun alternate scene for the ending of this film?
What's that?
Richard Parker survived. And he actually turns up at the grave of, spoilers for later on in the discussion, but the grave of Gwen Stacy. And he talks to Peter and they have this huge blowout and everything, and then they start talking, and yeah, he survived. Technically he's still alive. Mary's long dead apparently, because as you said, the film doesn't give two hoots about her, but Richard Parker survived. So yeah, did you see that scene by any chance?
No, I've not seen any deleted scenes or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, there are comic book adaptations which do have his parents being alive and returning, and I think there was one where Aunt May gives a right telling off for how neglectful they've been.
Sally Field's about to throw down hands with Richard Parker with her nursing training that went absolutely nowhere. I know we kind of just complained there about her not having much to do, but I feel as if in the second film they just said, screw it, just put her in a hospital and just have her look after people. And it's why? This is the thing that confused me, because don't get me wrong, I don't want to undersell nurses or anything, but it's she keeps saying things like, oh, I'm taking night classes to be a nurse and everything. Is it that easy to become a nurse over there, that you just take 1 or 2 night classes and then all of a sudden you're telling people what to do in their own wards?
There are courses where you can train to become a nurse, so I think that's feasible, and it might be that she was previously, and so she's needed a bit more, because I think the idea is that they don't have Ben's income or pension or whatever anymore.
Yeah, so they need to have a secondary source. Yeah, because she does have, not a meltdown, but she has an argument about that. She says that, oh, your Uncle Ben's not here and I need money to send you to college. So yeah, that's why she takes the job. But it just feels random that that's what they chose. And again, nothing against nurses or anything, but it just seems
she might have had previous experience as it, and she seems a very kind of caring individual. I guess it's supposed to kind of point to her as a character as being quite caring, and so they made her a nurse.
I was going to say it could have been worse. She could have been one of the pilots on those planes. Pull up, Devin.
Yeah, that was a very interesting scene. We cut away to this plane watchtower of them all celebrating. The guy's we have a job to do, get back to work. And it's why have we cut to this?
Who are you? I feel as if that is, before we go on to talk about the other characters, I feel as if that is my main problem with the sequel compared to the first one, because I feel as if the first film flows a lot better. It goes from Peter slowly becoming Spider-Man, and then he has to fight his, I was going to say mentor, but it's not really, it's just some dude that worked with his dad, and then all of a sudden he's oh right, you're related to some guy he used to work with. So
Spider-Man has always got some connection to his villain. It's so interesting that there's always some level of connection with whoever he's up against.
But see, to be fair, they are getting weaker compared to the Raimi trilogy. It looks as if he does have a connection, and don't get me wrong, I feel as if with him and the Lizard it's quite good, but then it's by the second film it's some random guy he saved on the street suddenly becoming a supervillain. You're okay, this is quite strange. But sorry, going back to my point there, I feel as if the second film is just 50 films just mashed into one, because this is what I was saying at the very beginning about the kind of detriment of the MCU, because I feel as if the MCU, as amazing as it is, every single studio at the time knew how lucrative it was. So you had I can't remember what you call it, was it the Monster Cinematic Universe?
Oh, the Dark Cinematic Universe.
That was the one, yeah, where they had the Mummy and no films after that because it didn't do well. You had the DCU, which kind of took off. In fact, I don't even know if the DCU would have been a thing back then, would it? Probably in the planning.
Not yet, because they just concluded with the Dark Knight Rises. Man of Steel had come out around that time, so that was the first of that kind of group of films. But yeah, there was no Aquaman or Batman versus Superman or Wonder Woman or anything like that yet.
When it came to the second film, they definitely wanted to do their own cinematic universe. They wanted to do their Sinister Six film, their Amazing Spider-Man 2, 3 and 4. They wanted, I think, a Black Cat spin-off. There was just so many. It was a film that... Do you know what it actually reminds me of, going back to the MCU? It reminds me of Age of Ultron. You know, that way where it was a load of things just mashed together, and then they were we're going to set up these pieces and then we're going to branch off from that. I mean, would you say that's the case? for this film?
I don't know. There's certainly aspects to it trying to set up other films. It wasn't super in your face until right at the end.
Oh yeah, with the Sinister Six, the wardrobe gallery.
Yeah.
Choose your character.
Yeah, so I do think that they were definitely hoping that this could evolve into more movies. And I think that was the plan up until they made the deal with Disney to do the Tom Holland Spider-Man and have that incorporated, was so much of a success that they were like, oh, we don't really want to return to this universe of Spider-Man because it wasn't as well received. So we want to just try and focus on this new one. And like, I think when they planned to do the Venom movie, the idea was that it would be connected to the Andrew Garfield universe, but I think they've retconned that to now be within the Tom Holland universe. Morbius, I don't know. I have zero idea where Morbius fits in. I did not watch that movie.
No, me neither.
So I don't know where Morbius fits in the grand Spider-Man universe scheme of things, but I can't see Jared Leto appearing in any MCU film anytime soon, that's for sure.
Well, you never know. It was such a global box office success. I mean, can you imagine if they just slipped in Morbius at the end of like the Amazing Spider-Man 2?
It's Morbin time.
Do you know what would be so funny? See if it's like at the end, you know how it's so stupid. The guy in shadows walks, but I can't even remember. They tell you his name.
It's like Fiefs or Fives or
Fives, Mr. Fife or Fief or whatever his name is. It's like he's walking by the like cabinets, and it's so dumb. Why would you make an armored suit and then purposely shape it like a rhino? The whole idea is, oh, it's supposed to be his somewhat identity, you know, the rhino. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was a guy in like a skin tight suit with a horn on his head, and he was just brutishly strong, but kind of makes no sense why it's like, oh yeah, let's make metal wings, let's make octopus arms, let's make a giant rhino here. I'm sure nobody's going to ask questions here. And you're like, there is a lot of non-auditing going on in this place. But can you imagine at the very end of that, it's just like a pair of like vampire teeth just sitting on the podium?
Just a bat just flying around a little room.
It's like, remember at the end of the first Iron Man film where I can't remember the actor who played War Machine, but it's Joey's friend, he turns around and he says, I'll be back for you later, or something like that. It's just like someone coming in, looking at the teeth, being like, I'll be back for you later. Okay, I've got a controversial take for these films, and before I dive into it, what are your opinions on the relationship between Peter and Gwen Stacy in this film? Because that is a moment and a particular dynamic that is very well received. But what do you think?
I like it. I think that it is a better chemistry and romance than Peter and MJ from the Raimi films. I think it works a lot better. I think they're very cute in a lot of their interactions with each other. The initial scene where he tries to ask her out and is all kind of nervous about it, and you can see that she's also kind of a bit kind of nervous and cutesy about it. That is very sweet. And because you don't really get that with Peter and MJ, where it's more like Peter's like this underdog guy going for like the hot girl, and so she's like throwing him a bone almost, where and he's like, yeah, woohoo kind of thing. Whereas Peter and Gwen here are both in each other's league. They work very well together. I don't want to say in each other's league. That sounds bad.
They're both a 10, okay.
Peter
no
and Gwen.
Tobey Maguire. Kirsten Dunst is allowed here.
Peter and Gwen are both awkward nerds. They are very similar. I think they work a lot better than this kind of like nerd fantasy of a nerd getting with the hot girl who's so much hotter than he is and one of the popular girls and that kind of thing. Like Gwen doesn't come across as like one of the popular girls. I think it's a lot more interesting. I think it works better. And of course, spoilers for the second film. We've got on here without worrying about spoilers so far. The death of Gwen Stacy is a very sad moment. And it's been one of comic books like saddest moments. I think the death of Gwen Stacy is cemented as being one of the most emotional scenes in comic book history, and the manner of her death as well is really graphic.
Before I go on to talk about what I think of Gwen Stacy, I feel as if that particular scene doesn't seem very warranted. If you think about the traditional 3-act structure, or rather 3-film structure, usually the second film, if you think back to the old Star Wars films, the second film, The Empire Strikes Back is where the hero's at the lowest point, but they're still kind of hopeful at the end of it. Here, they just absolutely destroy Peter Parker. They're just like, oh yeah, by the way, see the last 20 minutes, we're going to snap your girlfriend's neck. Jesus Christ, Mark Webb, what the hell? Oh, well, I know it's not his choice. I think it was probably an executive decision, because I'm pretty sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, but was that scene not in like all the promotional material? Her falling and the clock tower and everything at the time?
I think you're right. I think that was a lot of the promotional material of her falling, but obviously they didn't show the death. But I mean, it was pretty implied.
Yeah, because it is, you're right. It's a very iconic scene in the comics, and it is a scene that they did portray in the Sam Raimi film, which... yeah, it's not the same. They imply the same things, that, oh, he has to save the woman that he loves, and obviously saves them, because killing her off in the first one would be a bit of a downer, I'm not going to lie. But for the second one, I don't know what they were thinking, unless Emma Stone, who does a fantastic job in this, but unless her contract was maybe running out, I don't know, or she just wasn't signed on for any more films, maybe that's why. But I don't feel as if they had built up enough momentum or, likability of this particular iteration to then say, oh, by the way, we're killing her off. Because I do agree, I think that the relationship does work, but what I will say is I kind of prefer their relationship in the first film compared to the second one. Like, I feel as if in the first film there is that back and forth and everything, and it's very cutesy, it's very over the top, but I do like it. I think it's very sweet, and Gwen Stacy as a character is very capable. This is something I brought up last week, where you would usually get Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane screaming into the camera. Again, not her fault, but...
Sam Raimi loves a screaming woman directly into the camera.
Oh, I hate it. I absolutely hate it.
Every fucking transition was a screaming woman directly into the camera.
The one scene, actually, sorry, I know I'm going back to the Raimi films, but one scene I absolutely hate in the second one is, see when Dr. Octopus is climbing up the... I don't even know what building. It's like a building that's full of offices.
Yeah, and the woman runs away from the window.
Yeah, she runs back and forth, and then she runs right to the camera and screams, and I'm like, why? There's no reason for it. She could scream and run off screen, but she just screams into the camera, and you're like, really, Raimi? Really?
Who would do that? Who just stands in a room and screams like that? You would run screaming.
Yeah, it's silly. But anyway, I feel as if Gwen Stacy is a very independent and very capable character. She's not one to shy away from danger.
To her detriment at the end.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I don't agree with, because there's a scene where Peter, of course, he is haunted by her dad for the first, quarter of this film, and it is the most stupid thing ever, when he keeps looking over and he sees, the ghost face of her dad standing there, because in the first film, spoilers again, the first film, he gets killed off. So he's like, don't take my daughter, because, only bring her pain. And, he just sees him just standing there silently. What is this memeability rubbish? But anyway, so there's a moment where he webs her up to, a car to stop her from coming to the electro plant. No pun intended there to call it the electro plant, but it's basically where he has the big fight scene with Electro, and don't worry, we'll get on to Electro, but she absolutely runs him over with a car, which is hilarious. And then she makes this huge speech about him saying, oh, what are you, a Neanderthal? Oh, you're going off to war and I can't fight my battles. Don't get me wrong, I completely agree with that sentiment, but it's kind of contradicted when she does get killed in the end. And you're like, well, that was pointless speech. She got absolutely brutally murdered.
I think that is my criticism as well, that if they'd had another movie, if they'd known they had, which of course they did not have another movie, but if they had another movie and they knew they had another movie, I wish that they had spaced out the death of Gwen Stacy to the third movie, to at least give a movie's distance between the dad dying and his dying wish being keep her safe, don't hang out with her, and then the next movie, just not immediately, but by the end of the movie, killing her. You need that one movie gap at least, I think, for it to not feel clumsy. And I think that's what it ultimately ended up being. I think it ended up being quite a clumsy decision to kill her at that point. I think it ruins what they'd built up.
No, I totally agree with you there. I do think that they should have spaced it out a wee bit more. But the other criticism I will say that's more prevalent for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 than the first film is obviously they're trying to, get together and everything, but they waste so much time time with them saying, oh, will they get together, won't they? Because it's like, he practically kisses her right in front of the whole school and everything, and, you know, oh, they're dating, oh, it's fine. But then he has like an argument outside a dim sum place, and he's like, oh, I can't be with you anymore. And then there's another scene where it's like, oh, I can't be with you, oh, I can't be with you. And it feels like a completely different movie at that point. And that obviously is like my biggest gripe with the film, but especially for that, it feels as if we interrupt this superhero film for, I don't know, Hallmark/Channel 5 film. You have to stick to one thing or the other. Say what you will about the Sam Raimi or Tom Holland films, but at least they're both consistent with the way they portray everything and the way the pacing's set up. With this one, it does feel as if it's all over the place. And speaking of all over the place, will we move on to quite possibly one of the more, I don't even know if infamous is the right word, but the villains of this piece.
Yeah, we have three major villains across these two films. We have Dr. Connors as the Lizard in the first Amazing Spider-Man, and then we have both Electro and Harry Osborn Green Goblin in the second one. I don't mind the Lizard in the first Amazing Spider-Man. I think it's an interesting enough villain. I think that the actor Rhys Ifans, I think that he's a pretty decent actor portraying the role of Dr. Connors. I think that it's very kind of interesting. I don't enjoy his line when we kind of initially meet him, where we see that he has only one arm, and he goes, "I'm not a cripple, I'm a scientist." And I was like, I don't think you can say that. I think that's un-PC.
So what's that got to do with anything?
Yeah, you can be both. I mean, cripple is not a particularly great term anyway. I mean, the character has one arm. I guess he can use whatever language he wishes for himself, but like, you don't need to define yourself by either thing. You can be someone who is differently abled and also a scientist. That's not like an uncommon thing. People who have like one eye, or
Stephen Hawking,
or Stephen Hawking, or thing like that, like, we see them as having both this illness and that they're a great scientist.
You're completely right. It just seems like a weird line to throw in there, to be like, oh, I'm a capable scientist. All of the students looking around, our interns, going, nobody said that, what's wrong with you? No, I will agree. The only thing I will say about the Lizard as a whole is I'm not a big fan of the CGI, I have to say. I think he looks like a Goomba from the Super Mario Brothers film.
Yeah, I can understand that perspective. I think the CGI wasn't quite there yet in terms of making a convincing design. I mean, obviously the design itself didn't help, but I think that the CG just wasn't quite there yet.
I wish I could say it got better when they returned in No Way Home, but they hid him for like half the film, probably because they didn't want to animate him. They hid him for half the film.
I don't remember how different he was, actually. I'll be watching that film probably this week. I'll have to see if it's very much different, but yeah, I think it was an interesting take on the character. One thing I particularly liked, and this is more Spider-Man than the villain itself, but just in the first film, when Peter is like trying to identify like where he is and trying to kind of create a like warning signal, he like fires webs in like multiple directions to use like a vibration technique on the webs. And it's the most spider-like thing that I think any Spider-Man has done that I've seen in the Spider-Man movies. And I was like, that is such a neat little trick. I really like that. So I thought that was really cool. I like that a lot. Did not enjoy Peter attempting to take a picture of the Lizard and leaving his fucking name on the back of his camera.
To be fair, though, he was still in school. You can kind of understand that, as stupid as it is. You can kind of understand why he would make such a rookie mistake. But the one thing I don't like, and this is going to sound like a really minor thing, and you might think, oh, is it when he tries to turn the whole city into lizards? Like, no, I don't like that idea, but at the same time, I can see why the character does it. You know, it's because he wants him to be like superhuman, or super lizard, as it were. But it's the way he says poor Peter Parker, and I'm not going to try to replicate it.
It sounds like Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Doesn't it? It's like, I don't want to be popping into your ear to say it, but it's just such a weird way to say
Peter Parker.
Picture, pickle, pickled peppers. And then he's just locked up and never really brought up again. Yeah, I would say out the three villains, he is probably the strongest. Electro, I don't know how to feel about Electro, I have to say.
Yeah, I'm very mixed on him as well.
I feel as if there was scope to make him tragic, and I feel as if they learned nothing from Spider-Man 3. Again, there's this whole argument I'm making that say what you will about Spider-Man 3, but at least the tone was consistent with it. But the fact they had two separate villains, Electro being one of them, and this weird German doctor, I text you, Andrew, when I was watching this film, I think the actual character is like a comic character, supposedly. I don't know if it's supposed to be like a woman in the comics or whatnot. I don't know enough about the character to have like a definitive thing to say, oh, it's a bad representation. But the fact they go for like the German mad scientist route of we have ways of making you talk, yeah, and you're like, this is 2014, might I just add. It's not like the Raimi era. I think the most offensive accent they probably had was that woman on the violin in the Raimi films, but in this one you're just like, why do we have like a German, like he was bothered about that as I was when you first saw that.
It does feel very like movie villain where they're like, oh, who should we cast? The Nazi scientist kind of role.
And the Russian.
Yeah, like it's always either Russian or German or occasionally British. I've just looked up Dr. Kafka, who the character is playing, and it is usually a woman. It seems like they made the brave choice of casting a German scientist to play a role usually played by a woman. I don't think it was a particularly interesting character. It was just kind of like cookie cutter evil scientist number 3. I didn't like that choice very much. I thought Electro himself was an interesting-ish villain. I liked some of what they were doing. The special effects, the electricity, was beautiful.
Yeah, I will agree there.
Particularly in Amazing Spider-Man 2 as opposed to Amazing Spider-Man 1. Amazing Spider-Man 1 had some very good special effects as well. But I think the special effects and the lighting choices and whatnot for Amazing Spider-Man 2 was very, very well done. I think it was very pretty. Did not like the choice of music. The dubstep choice
wob wob
for Electro was interesting. I guess they were like, oh, we need electric music. What's like electric music? We'll go dubstep.
What's that Skrillex chap doing today?
Yeah, and the fact they made Itsy Bitsy Spider into dubstep at the end.
Hardcore, yeah.
God, what was this choice? His motivation of just being like weird, obsessed guy who no one pays attention to and so is obsessed with the fact that anyone who gives him the time of day is his new favorite friend and obsesses over them kind of thing. That is interesting, but I don't know. I think it's just a bit lazy, the way that he got his powers of falling into like the vat of eels. Why are villains always falling into vats of things? Who's leaving all these open vats for people to fall into?
Poor safety regulations, apparently.
I was actually thinking that exact thing when I was watching the movie. I was like, why is he reaching over to fix this cable? The safety regulations here are ridiculous. I understand he wanted to get out so he could get to his party because it was his birthday. But like, if he designed the grid and was very familiar with electricity, he would know plugging these in together was going to electrocute himself. So he should have made sure he had the right kind of equipment before he attempted to use that. So I think that was very poor writing. The fact that someone who is smart enough that they designed an entire electrical grid apparently wouldn't know to use the right safety equipment when handling high voltage equipment. So I don't think that was very smartly done. The use of his powers was very interesting, like his phasing in and out of like existence and like rematerialize himself. He was almost like Dr. Manhattan at times.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I have to say, rewatching it, I was like, very Watchmen-esque. I have to admit, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but do you remember Batman Forever? The one with the Riddler?
Oh, the Jim Carrey one?
Yeah, that's the one. I mean, it's been a while since I've seen Batman Forever, but it does remind me of Jim Carrey's character, that both of them are obsessed fanatics of either Bruce Wayne or Batman and Batman Forever, and of course Spider-Man in this one, but they're both fanatics of these particular heroes, and when their heroes betray them, they're like, oh no, I gotta kill them or make them suffer, blah blah. Yeah, it just seems as if it is a trope that is safe enough, you know, it's like it's something we have seen before and we've seen it done, but I don't know, I don't feel as if, again, I'm probably going to sound like a broken record here, but the fact that we don't really get enough time to learn about Max, don't get me wrong, we learn everything that, oh, he's a loner, he's obsessed with Spider-Man, because there is a weird scene where he's got, ironically enough, the same thing Peter does later on for his dad. He has like the huge wall of Spider-Man stuff on it to celebrate his birthday. He has to wrestle with the Harry Osborn subplot, the Gwen and Peter subplot, the totally spy subplot with his parents. The fact that Peter, for some reason, goes underground and finds an even undergroundier train that rises up from the tracks, which, how? Why? Who put that there? I don't know. But, I mean, that was a weird side scene. Because I know why they put it in and everything. It was to be like, oh, Peter, don't use my blood. It's poisonous, Peter. But yeah, they put that in. So you're wrestling with all these subplots. And of course, as we said, the Aunt May subplot. So you're wrestling with all these subplots. And he doesn't really get time to breathe. So see, when he becomes a villain, it doesn't really feel earned. You know, he just suddenly snaps and becomes a villain.
Yeah, I guess the powers made him a lot easier to anger. And like he seemingly, when he walked out into the street and into Times Square, clearly like needing to absorb electricity, and like he kind of had that desire, it seemed like he was scaring people. And I think initially he was trying to be good and calm down, and then he got shot by the sniper, and that's what triggered him to be bad. And seeing that Spider-Man then got the attention and that seemingly was kind of against him, flipped him over the edge. But yeah, if the sniper hadn't shot him, would Spider-Man have been able to de-escalate the situation enough that they could have dealt with it better? It's hard to say. There are moments where you kind of do feel for him, but it was a very strange character. And I think it says a lot that in No Way Home, when we get him back again, he has a very different appearance and mannerisms. He's not the kind of like nervous, nerdy guy that he was in this movie. They change him up quite a lot. I guess Jamie Foxx didn't want to go through that makeup to look all kind of weird like that again.
Fair enough, to be fair.
Yeah, I can sympathize.
Going back to the Times Square scene, I do find it horribly ironic that there's a particular scene where Electro fires all of the electricity towards is it like the Red Steps? I don't know if there's like a official name for them, but it's like, you know how all the people are running up the stairs and they're about to grab onto the sides and they're going to get like absolutely electrocuted, and then there's a car coming towards them, and in that split second, Spider-Man has hyper senses where he's like, okay, what I've got to do is I've got to stop the car, then I've got to stop these two people from touching the rails.
Yeah.
So it's like there's so many things going on at once that he can calculate. But when it comes to saving Gwen Stacy, he wasn't so good at that, was he?
Yeah, I mean, you can argue that it's a little bit of a different situation, but
yeah, I know he was tired and he was fighting the Green Goblin. I know. I'm riffing. In case any Andrew Garfield fans do come after me.
The one thing I will mock about that Gwen Stacy scene is the web forming a hand.
I actually don't mind that, I have to say.
I think it looks cheesy. I don't like it very much.
Their whole relationship was cheesy, to be fair.
Going back to Electro, though, yeah, there was a lot of his comments that I was like, ugh, that wasn't very good. There was one moment I actively booed at the screen where he went, "It's my birthday and now it's time to light my candles," and then he like fired off his like electric powers at people. I was like, oh, boo, that sucked. Back to the drawing board.
I was like, when did he say that? And I went, oh yeah, it was after he got his powers. Yeah, that was that.
I was talking to my partner about this. I was like, it's no longer his birthday. And maybe I can give him the benefit of the doubt that maybe he didn't realize because he died and then like woke up the next day. But I'm pretty sure that it's not his birthday at that point.
See, in all honesty, that's all you know about him. He lives alone, he designed the grid, and he has a birthday. That's his three kind of defining characteristics, I want to say. He doesn't really have much else going, and I know that's the point of the character, but when you're watching a film, it doesn't really make it interesting if it's not more focused on him. But speaking of focus, the final character that we have to talk about before we finish up is Harry Osborn, who has goblinitis. I don't even know what it is he's got.
No, I don't think they ever specify the disease. I think it's made up shit.
The big goblin. Yeah, I genuinely don't know, so I'm going to call it goblinitis. But it's weird because 1 minute he's fine, and then by the end of the film, he's obviously like retching and turning literally green. And it's like, how long did it take for his dad to turn versus him? But, you know, obviously they put it in to raise the stakes and everything.
I think the point his dad was making on his deathbed was like he's handing him like these files that elongated his life. Obviously they weren't very good, and he had a poor life from it, and so I think Harry was trying to find a better solution so he didn't have to be like bedridden while others try and like figure stuff out for him.
I just feel overall their relationship between Peter and Harry is not as strong, I would say. Obviously they make it out as if, oh, they've been best friends forever, but Harry went out the country to Europe for some reason while Peter fought like a giant lizard and everything, and they obviously, I know why, because they didn't have that all planned out at the time of the Amazing Spider-Man getting filmed, but they do make it out as if they have like this long history. Yeah, it doesn't really feel as if they have like a long history together. And you said something, and I hope you don't mind me bringing this up, but you said something quite controversial when you said that, do you still believe this, that this Harry is worse than the Raimi Harry?
I found him to be insufferable in this. There are moments where Dane DeHaan is good as Harry, and I think that he is interesting, but he's such a smug little shit. And like, you can say like that's intentional and that's how Harry Osborn should be, but like, I just did not buy his character very well. And I don't think that the way he acted was not the way someone who Peter would have been friends with would have acted. You wouldn't think that Peter, growing up, raised by Uncle Ben and Aunt May, would not be hanging out with the smug little shit. He would get into fights with the smug little shits. I don't think that was an accurate representation of who Harry Osborn should have been. I think there are moments where he does show a stronger side. Then there are moments where he's having the conversation with Peter about Gwen and like asks if Gwen's a model employee at Oscorp. And I was like, oh, that's such a cringy line. Like that's really that's such an uncomfortably cringy line. Then when he transforms and appears like hovering on the glider and he's got this like weird grin on his face, he looks so stupid. And the lines are awful and cheesy and everything doesn't quite work. I can't put into words well enough, I'm afraid, but he is just not an interesting enough interpretation of it. I don't like James Franco's interpretation much. And of course, there's huge criticisms around how he acts it and portrays it. But I think there are moments where each are better and each are worse than each other. I don't think necessarily either are how Harry Osborn should be portrayed, but I don't think that Dane DeHaan does a good job.
He definitely chews the scenery, but not in the best ways. I brought this up, and I know we were discussing it last week, but the idea that James Franco as Harry Osborn, at least he comes across as being very awkward. At least in the first couple of films. I know I've said that I wasn't a big fan of his acting, but at least he comes across as awkward, and you can kind of get why Peter would be his friend. But you're completely right. In this film, it's just as if, oh, this rich arsehole who's like, oh, I'm dying of goblinitis. In this film, Harry Osborn as a character doesn't really seem to be likeable. And I know, obviously, oh, he's a villain, why should he be likeable? But you can't even see him as like a tragic figure because he kills off Gwen Stacy, who, at this point anyway, in our discussion, is probably the better love interest. So to be the only Green Goblin so far that has killed a love interest, just a weird choice. I'm going to be honest, it's a weird choice overall with just everything. With the Green Goblin, with the way he acts as Harry Osborn, with the way he acts as I said, the Goblin, with the way he does that weird thing that, is it Jesse Eisenberg does in not Man of Steel, Batman vs Superman, when they arrest him, and they kind of allude to, oh, there's a bigger plan in play, and they give out all of their suits, which is dumb as hell. Wrapping up our kind of thoughts overall on this particular entry, how would you rate the Amazing Spider-Man films? Would you say they stand up? Would you say they were overly criticised, or would you say they weren't overly criticised enough?
I think they stand up, and I think that they both stand up, and I think that they are underrated. I do think that they are worthy representations of the Spider-Man comic books. I think that they are probably the closest interpretation to the comic books of any of the Spider-Man movies. I think they do very well at that. I do like some of the relationships, as we've mentioned before. I like the relationship between Peter and Gwen. I enjoy the Sally Fields character as Aunt May. I think that's very well done. I think that the special effects are very well done. And as I've mentioned, I really, really like how Andrew Garfield portrays Spider-Man. I think he is arguably the best at portraying Spider-Man. But I do think that there are a lot of weaknesses to these two movies. I would not hold them in as high regard as many. I think that the first Amazing Spider-Man is on par with the best of the Sam Raimi movies, but the second Amazing Spider-Man is on par with Spider-Man 3. So it does well in some regards and doesn't do well in others, and I think it kind of holds its head at a very similar level to what the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films are able to achieve. I think it's as worthy a representation as the initial trilogy. But what are your thoughts?
I'll give you a fun fact before I dive into my thoughts, but do you know this is the only Spider-Man film with a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes?
Oh, really? That's very interesting.
Even compared to Spider-Man 3, which is really surprising to me personally, but what I will say is I felt as if the Amazing Spider-Man films held up better than I remembered them, because obviously we've both aged a lot since we first saw them in the cinemas and everything. I think that they do a good job for what they're trying to portray, but I also do think that they are quite grim at times. I think that tonally they're all over the place. This is what I'll say. The actors, for the most part, do a fantastic job. Like, I feel as if out of maybe all three of them, bar maybe a couple of exceptions in the MCU, I feel as if the acting is probably the strongest here. You know, I think Andrew Garfield does a great job, and I have to say it wasn't until I watched him in No Way Home that I actually reconsidered that, oh, maybe I was too harsh on him when I watched it initially. So I went back and rewatched it, and I thought, well, actually, it wasn't as bad. It was just kind of everything around in terms of plot, tone, pacing, those kind of things which brought the films down. What I will say as well, even for the second one, I was very surprised at the positive reception that I found that a lot of people had for this film. So, for example, I put out a tweet saying that I was actually rewatching this film, and I said, what do you think of this film? Do you think it's overhated, or do you think it's not criticised enough? And I have to admit, there were some hilarious responses. One from the Space Castle podcast said, it's like if early 90s Joel Schumacher made a Spider-Man movie, which I think was scathing. God of Pod said, I really enjoyed it because Andrew Garfield is my fave Spidey. There's a ton of pointless dead space in the movie, but I don't care. Overhated in my opinion. Some of the Spidey action is top drawer. Absolutely agree. The Nostalgic podcast as well had said it was overhated and he loves this movie, and yes, they tried to jam too much into this, as Sony does, but it wasn't bad at all. Just missed a few beats of a solo, but it was overall a good show. There's actually a lot of really mixed opinions, because that's the thing with these kind of films. Usually you expect everybody to hate them, everybody to say, oh, I think this is the worst thing since unsliced bread and everything. But the majority, even from, there's another comment here from the Scottish Wrestling Network podcast that says, it was a disservice to Andrew Garfield. I loved his Spider-Man, but the second film let him down, which seems to be quite a universal consensus. There's another one reiterating what I said earlier, the podcast Nobody Asked For, saying it's a perfect example of when a film focuses too much on setting up a future story rather than telling its actual current story. But there is such a mix, to be honest. I was just really surprised when I put out that tweet, because I expected everyone to relatively come back and say, oh, we thought this was a terrible film, burn it, and that wasn't the case. It's interesting to see that although The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 are considered as that awkward middle child, of the franchise, it's not as revered as the Raimi trilogy, but it's not as beloved as the MCU ones which have come out. It's kind of that middle awkward transitional phase, and I feel as if a lot of that is just purely because it came out at the time it did. And don't get me wrong, I know there's a lot of talented people involved in this film, and I'm really happy that Andrew Garfield got a second chance through No Way Home. But I do agree, I feel as if the Amazing Spider-Man 2 definitely let his character and the actor as a whole, all the actors involved, really down with a lot of things, whether that be studio interventions or rewrites or whatever the reason was behind the failings of this film. I think it is just a shame that it went out the way it did, because there's a lot in this film. I'm going to end in a more positive note, but I feel as if there's a lot in this film that there is to like about it. As we said, the Spider-Man, the action's good, the actors are good. The one thing I will say, and this is probably going to sound so disgusting, but the one thing I'm not a big fan of is, see, the first-person perspective of Spider-Man swinging.
That's interesting. I actually quite enjoyed that. I thought it was quite unique because we haven't really had that before.
I like it in the first film, I have to say, even though it's clear it's been made for the big screen, like for IMAX or something like that. The second film, and also there is like a weird kind of first-person view where you're right up against Peter's face in the first one. You're like, what is that? But the one I actually did laugh at was at the very beginning, after the whole plane crash scene, is the scene where Spider-Man's swinging through the city, and you get this weird POV from his crotch, and everybody's like, oh, it's so cool, I'm flying like Spider-Man. And I'm sitting looking around going, is nobody else noticing that the camera's practically coming out his crotch?
I did actually notice that when I was watching. I was like, this can't quite be POV because we're not seeing it from what would be eye level. But yeah, I think it was almost like around his like stomach, around his waist, or like his chest or something like that. It was not eye level where the camera was, so that was a bit of a strange choice. I did enjoy that kind of perspective, that angle. I thought that was interesting. I think what you were saying earlier about the time it came out being unfortunate, I agree with that. I think that it being kind of nestled between a very successful group of MCU movies was difficult for it in terms of like having the comparison there. And people were always, because of like how it was not that long after the Sam Raimi films, people were always going to compare it to those films, and particularly with nostalgia glasses, having so many see that incarnation as their Spider-Man, that was the definitive Spider-Man, because it was really the first for the majority of people. So it was always going to be an uphill battle for these two movies. And I don't think it didn't necessarily help itself in some ways, but I don't think that it deserves the criticism that it got.
And once again, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on and not only subjecting yourself to both of these films again, but yeah, just coming on and discussing these films in great length.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me on, and I'm very much looking forward to wrapping up this with the final 3 movies that we're going to discuss.
Oh yeah, I can't wait for us to move on to the MCU and finally discuss probably, I'm going to leave it there because I was going to say probably everybody's favourite iteration, but that is quite debatable. So it's going to be a lot of watching from both of us.
Oh God, yeah.
A lot of research. I expect like a whole IMDb page worth of trivia from you next week.
You will be disappointed.
See me after class. It's just a wiki link. But yeah, what did you think of the Amazing Spider-Man films? Did you think they lived up to the hype? Did you think, maybe not? Please let us know. Either reach out to us on Twitter at ChatSunamiPod or reach out on the contact page of the Chatsunami website, podpage.com/Chatsunami. But yeah, before we wrap up, is there anything you want to plug, Andrew?
Yeah, for sure. If people would like to follow me, they can do at GreenShield95 on Twitter and at GreenShield95 on Twitch, where I sometimes stream some things like GeoGuessr, recently streamed some Doom, sometimes some Call of Duty, sometimes some FIFA. Yeah, I'm a pretty eclectic group of games that I often stream. I'm going to be looking to see some more games to stream soon. So yeah, check me out if you have not already. I always appreciate a follow. I'm hoping to get affiliate by the end of spring.
Definitely go check that out. Absolutely fantastic content. But until then, thank you all so much for swinging by. As always, stay safe, stay awesome, and most importantly,
stay hydrated.
I was actually waiting for a funny line.
We don't always have to be funny, Satsu.
Yes, you're right. This is a serious moment.
With great power comes great endings.
You have a moral obligation to have a serious ending. Not choice, responsibility.